And now I'd like to welcome our SIGGRAPH 2011 keynote speaker, Cory Doctorow. Cory is the author of several books and co-editor of the popular Boing Boing blog. I read this blog every day, and I really encourage you to do the same. There's always something on it that is just fascinating. Cory is also a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and Wired. Cory was formerly the Director of European Affairs for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. This is a nonprofit civil liberties group that defends freedom in technology law, policy, standards, and treaties. He is a visiting senior lecturer at Open University in the UK and has previously served as the Fulbright Chair at the Annenberg Center for Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. His novel, Little Brother, was a New York Times bestseller, and his latest works include the novel Maker, For the Win, a young adult book about video games, labor politics, and economics, and a short story collection entitled Overclocked, Stories of the Future Present. He has won the Locust and Sunburst Awards, and he has been nominated for the Hugo, Nebula, and British Science Fiction Awards. And frankly, I could go on, but I won't. So please join me in welcoming Cory Doctorow.
Hi there. So notwithstanding the remarks you've heard earlier and the sign you saw by the door, for my talk only, I grant you unequivocal permission to record video, audio, and to use those recordings as the legal doggerel has it in all media now known or yet to be invented throughout the known universe. All I ask is if you do something cool with it, send me an email. I'm the first Cory in Google. I'm easy to find. So that's not actually a bad way to prefigure the talk, which is, of course, about copyright. If you know what I do, I go around and I talk about copyright. And whenever we argue about copyright, we get bogged down in a kind of ridiculous copyright is good, copyright is bad, polarized debate. And of course, that's very silly. After all copyright is a set of technical rules to manage the entertainment industry and its supply chains. And it makes perfect sense to have rules for a big, complicated industry like that. And arguing about whether or not rules themselves are a bad idea is dumb. What we should be talking about is which rules we want. So everyone knows that taking away rules is always better is a really silly rhetorical proposition, and it's a cheap debating trick to say that anyone who wants to reform the rules wants to abolish them. It's possible to say, I disagree with you, this roadway should be running at 120 kilometers an hour and not 90, without actually meaning I don't want to have a speed limit at all. At the same time, more rules are always better doesn't make sense. You may notice that your neighborhood has improved since they put a stop sign in every corner. It doesn't follow that it will improve again if they put a stop sign halfway between each of those standing stop signs. So here in the digital age, everything we do involves making copies. Millions and billions of copies. Collectively, the people in this room have probably made more mechanical copies than the entire human race had up to 1909 when the first non-literary copyrights were brought in the United States. Here in the digital age, we copy like we breathe. And so the stakes for getting the rules right on copyright have never been higher. So today, I want to get beyond the copyright is good, copyright is bad argument and dig into some meatier questions like, what do we want copyright to do? And how do we make a copyright that does that? Let's start with something that everyone in this room, I think, will agree with. Copyright should serve as an incentive to creativity. A good copyright system results in more people making more creations. One of copyright's most important goals is to serve creators. Now, about 15 years ago, the world's governments started looking at modernizing copyright for the digital age. Pretty much the first order of business was to ensure that the technologies intended to prevent copying got some special protections in the law. So WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, is the UN agency that makes the world's multilateral copyright treaties. I sometimes say they have the same relationship to bad copyright law that Mordor has to evil. But having served as a delegate to WIPO, I can tell you that there are some very good people there who want to do good. And in 1996, they promulgated the WIPO Copyright Treaty that said that nations should adopt special protections for what WIPO calls technical protection measures, but you probably know them better as digital rights management, or in Canada recently, they've called them digital locks. And in 1998, this came to the US in law in something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which you've no doubt heard about. It's one of the most notorious pieces of legislation of our century. And the DMCA didn't just do what WIPO's treaty demanded of it in respect of digital locks, it went further. It said that we won't just protect locks that are protecting copyright, we will protect the locks themselves, regardless of whether or not they prevent you from doing something that copyright would allow. That's a complicated idea. What does it mean? Well, it means that if you're a user of a creative work, we have this dichotomy between users and creators, and I'll get into that in a bit. But if you're a user of a creative work, it meant that the stuff that the law had allowed you, that Congress had sat down and said users should get, was all of a sudden taken away from you. So even though the law might allow you to format shift or back up or time shift or quote for the purposes of criticism or discussion, if a digital lock prevented you from doing that, you were no longer allowed to do that in the law, because breaking the lock was illegal, even if you wanted to break the lock to do something that the law allowed. And of course, the most voracious consumers of information are creators. There's a reason that whenever you see an author's headshot, including this one here that they've got of me at the start of this talk, they're shot against a backdrop of a bookcase crammed with books. And you see filmmakers standing in front of large libraries of film or stills from film and so on. And that's because in order to create, you must use a lot of creative works. But for people who weren't who were especially engaged in creation and publication, there was a secondary effect of this special protection under the law that was much subtler and much more drastic. It meant that DRM companies got more of a say over our works than we have. So for an example of that, look at the iTunes Store, which has mandatory DRM policies for video and audiobooks. If you're a video maker, an audiobook maker, and you want to sell your works through the iTunes Store, Apple requires you to add their DRM to it. It's not negotiable. So say you sell $1 million worth of audiobooks through Apple's audiobook channel, which is run by Audible. And between iTunes and Audible, that's 90% of the entire worldwide audiobook market, right in that channel. And you decide afterwards that you actually think you can get a better deal out of one of Apple's competitors, some spunky new startup that's in the process of doing to iTunes what iTunes did to all those really lame music and video stores before they came along. So there's one problem. You can't grant your customers, your listeners, your readers, permission to break DRM from iTunes off of their audiobooks and bring them with them to the new platform. Neither can the publisher. The only entity that's allowed to authorize people to take works that were sold in Apple's store to a competitor's media management platform is Apple. And Apple historically has not been in the go ahead and break our DRM business. So that means that your fans either have to abandon you or maintain two separate, non-interoperable parallel libraries of your stuff and use different devices, different managers, and different systems to get at them. So here you have three all-important entities in the copyright equation. Someone who wrote a book, a company that invested in making the audio edition and publishing it, and a company that contributed no creative labor whatsoever and made no investment in the book's production, but did take the step of adding DRM to it. So who gets the lion's share of copyright? Who gets to say, yes, you are allowed to copy this file made up of my precious, expensive-to-produce creative bits? It's not the creator. It's not the investor. It's the DRM provider. And of course, this is even worse for those of you who create episodic or series content like TV shows, where every penny your audience spends is a penny they'll have to forfeit to follow you to some competing platform. This isn't copyright as a friend of a creator. This is copyright as the friend of a DRM vendor. The funny thing is that it would be piss easy to write a version of the DMCA that made sure that creators got the lion's share of copyright. All you have to do is say it's illegal to break DRM unless you're doing so for a purpose that copyright allows. It's easy. If you want to make sure that it's illegal to break DRM to make illegal copies, then just write a law that says It's illegal to break DRM to do something illegal. Because otherwise, what you're saying is, whatever use your DRM locks up, illegal, legal, left, right, up or down, we will spend an infinite number of tax dollars making sure that no one ever breaks that lock and no one ever makes those uses. So what company wouldn't take up the government on an offer like this? Now, some companies have figured out how to do this like virtuosos. And Exhibit A is the Apple iOS ecosystem. And I don't mean to pick on Apple, but they're very good at this. They're very good at most of the things that they do. So if you want to see how laws protecting DRM can go wrong, look at how Apple uses it with iOS. Apple uses DRM to make sure that only apps bought from Apple will run on iPhones, iTouches, and iPads. So even if you go ahead and write some code that's compatible with Apple's platform, you can't sell it or give it away to an iOS user unless Apple approves it and adds it to the App Store. And Apple, of course, gets to take their 30%. If Apple doesn't like your app, they won't sell it, and that's fair enough. I used to work in a bookstore. If I didn't like your book, I wouldn't sell it either. But it's against the law for anyone to open a competing store that users can visit if they don't like Apple's judgment. If Apple sells your app to me, and I want to ditch my iOS device and run the same app inside a runtime on a competing platform like Android or whatever it is Nokia is doing this week, only Apple can give me permission to move your apps when I go. And only Apple can give me permission to run your code on my device. So every time someone buys into the iOS ecosystem and increases its footprint, it increases the need for software authors and interactive media creators to sell their wares there. But every time someone buys an app from Apple, it makes it more expensive for creators and audiences to move to competitors. And the more popular Apple has gotten, the worse the deal has gotten for creators. Now that Apple has established itself as the powerhouse distribution channel for interactive media, it's decided that you have to not only give them 30% of the purchase price of your apps, but 30% of every dollar that someone spends using your app even after the sale has been executed. Now, there has never in history been a time when tight controls over distribution were good for artists. Fewer labels always means worse deals for musicians. Fewer studios always means worse deal for people who work in the movies. Fewer publishers always means worse deals for authors. And it's no different with the distribution bottlenecks created by the DMCA and handed to canny companies like Apple. Now, you might think that 15 years after the US got it so terribly wrong with the DMCA that other governments would be lining up to get it right. But you'd be wrong. So there's a guy named James Moore. He's the Conservative Member of Parliament for Port Moody, Westwood, Port Coquitlam, which is only about 20 kilometers from here. He's the co-author of Bill C-32, introduced in Canada's last Parliament, to be Canada's version of the DMCA. And he made exactly and precisely the same mistake that the Americans made in 1998. Making a mistake about the way that digital copyright should work in 1998 is forgivable. It might have been hard to see way back then how things might go. But more than a decade later, with all the facts in hand about what happens with DMCA-like rules, it is inexcusable to repeat those mistakes. Certainly, we can't characterize it as an accident. Now, worst of all, many of Canada's creators and studios, labels, and publishers endorsed this bizarre proposal to give the meatiest part of Canada's copyright protection over to companies that made DRM, not creative works. It's a real throat-cutting business backing proposals like this. I mean, it's not as though DRM actually stops copying. The DRM in iOS is usually broken a day after it's updated. And what could be a bigger joke than DRM on ebooks? I mean, it's like publishers have never heard of typists. Now, why doesn't DRM work? Well, because in order to make DRM work, you have to design a device that can successfully resist the commands given to it by its owner. That is, you have to design general-purpose computing platforms that only run programs when they don't upset the platform's owner's apple cart. And the thing is, to make that work, you have to make sure that the smartest person in the world can't break it, because once it's broken for that guy, it's broken for everyone. Because either the crack appears on the net, or the unencrypted file appears on the net, and then all you need to do to be elite hacksaw with that DRM is type Smurfs movie BitTorrent into Google. Real security experts and cryptographers think that DRM is an impossibility. We can't design security systems that never leak, that can't be patched, and that attempt to hide their secrets and equipment belonging to adversaries who have infinite capital, infinite expertise, and infinite technology, and whose very nature makes it break once, break everywhere. Now, entertainment companies may have been convinced that there's hope for DRM, but they're wrong. And when they're fooled into endorsing laws like Bill C-32, they're stabbing themselves in the back by creating a marketplace where the DRM vendors hold all the cards and where the only way to get a fully functional, pristine copy of their works is to steal it. Because when you buy it, you end up with a crippled computer that tries to control its owner, you. Now, I call this Doctorow's first law. It's my grandiose first law. Anytime someone puts a lock on something that belongs to you and won't give you the key, they didn't put the lock there for your benefit. I mean, duh. Now, if you're paying close attention, you notice I said Doctorow's first law, which implies that there are more, and indeed there are 2 more laws, and that's what the rest of this talk will be about. Here's my second law. Fame won't guarantee fortune, but no one has ever gotten rich by being obscure. This is an important corollary to the DRM doesn't work stuff. After all, the internet is a copying machine. Computers are copying machines. A bit that can't be copied, in the immortal words of Bruce Schneier, is like water that isn't wet. We talk about reading and writing bits, but there is no reading bits. There's only copying bits. We talk about streaming versus downloading, but unless you're sending that video to the remote side by reflecting it through a cunning array of mirrors and tubes, you have sent them a copy. The technology sage Tim O'Reilly has said many famous things, but one of my favorites is, for most artists, the problem isn't piracy, it's obscurity. Now, a lot of people who hear that think that what Tim meant was that if you get famous, you'll be rich. And of course, that's not true. There are a lot of people out there who've been made famous without becoming rich at all, and the entertainment world is full of people who can tell you about how their movie or game or book or song was copied millions of times and they never saw a dime from all that exposure. Fame is nice, but you can't eat it, you can't use it to pay your kids' dentist bills, and you certainly can't get a ticket to SIGGRAPH with it. So there are plenty of people for whom fame has not worked. But there's one important thing to note about fame. Everyone who's attained commercial success had it. That is, it's a contradiction in terms to be both unknown and commercially successful. Creative fame might not make you rich, but you can't get rich without it. The people who might love your stuff if the people who might love your stuff don't know it exists, they can't pay you for it. They might still not pay you for it once they know it exists, of course. But satisfying the people who want to buy my stuff know it exists condition is an obvious dependency for executing the people who like my stuff have paid me for it program. There are lots of ways to turn fame into money. You can sell stuff, you can ask for donations, you can perform, you can wrap works in advertisements, you can license it, you can take commissions. But whatever it is you plan to do to make money, you can't do any of it unless people want to be your audience. And lucky for us, we have the internet, which, in addition to being a copying machine, is also an audience machine. It's never been easier to put a work into the hands of someone who wants to see it. It's never been easier to get distribution, and while getting paid is hard, it's always been hard. But compare delivering to 3 consoles by selling cartridges in big box stores to delivering your games to browsers, consoles, tablets, phones, all via everything from your DIY shopping cart with a PayPal backend to Steam. Or compare narrow theatrical exhibition windows, 3 national broadcasters and half a dozen major DVD retailers, with all the ways we have now to distribute video to the world. Figuring out how to get people to care enough about your stuff to download it is still a hard problem, and it's always been a hard problem, although things like Blogger and Twitter have made it a little easier, and so has easy, low-cost copying. Copying solves the getting stuff to your audience problem. You can stick your video on YouTube or Vimeo or archive.org. You can stick your ebook in the Kindle store on Smashwords, or stick a donate button on your website. Games, photos, 3D meshes. There's never been more easy to search, easy to enter distribution channels than there are today. But this is only possible because intermediaries, companies like YouTube, Vimeo, Amazon, the Internet Archive, Blogger, WordPress, Thingiverse, Rackspace, and your mom and pop ISP down on the corner, are not required in law to act as bad content cops and then make sure that everything is clean before it goes live. After all, it's inconceivable that those intermediaries could do it. Imagine if YouTube had to get a copyright lawyer to review every video they get, all 50 plus hours every minute of every day. There just aren't enough lawyer hours between now and the heat death of the universe for them to accomplish this task. But all over the world, entertainment companies and their pals in Western governments are trying to pass laws that will make intermediaries responsible for what their users do. They're saying that our countries should copy Syria and China off and run off the cliff with them and build national firewalls and then use those firewalls to block sites that are used by pirates. They're saying that those sites used by pirates need to shape up or ship out, that they should have the duty to police their servers and kill anything that infringes copyright. But sites used by pirates is just another way of saying sites used by everybody. Because there isn't a single file that the Pirate Bay indexes that isn't indexed on Google and Bing. An Indio tour in a garage may be able to make an awesome movie, but it doesn't necessarily follow that she can build a video hosting site to distribute it, or that she can run it as efficiently, cheaply, and robustly as YouTube. This Venn diagram of companies that can make a great video game and companies that can replicate Amazon S3 for the back end has a very small intersection. So we need intermediaries who can provide the plumbing through which our works flow, because without them, we have to bear the cost of production and the cost of distribution, and most of us can't do that. We need file lockers like you send it and Dropbox and MailBigFile because they've become essential to our production chain. Sending files used to be a chore, and now it's trivial, and no substantial creative work is done without a lot of this sort of file swapping. But all of these lockers are under attack. Laws like the proposed US Protect IP Act, the UK Digital Economy Act, and international agreements like the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, or ACTA, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership all throw more liability at intermediaries, especially these file lockers. Ironically, the thing that the lobbyists from the entertainment industry hate about file lockers is exactly the thing that we need them for when we use them to make creative works, that they have a privacy switch. That's why creators use them. No one wants to put test shots or gold masters on a public server. You need privacy to use these services to make the commercial works that we earn our living from. And of course, this is just going to get worse because cloud services like on-call virtual machines create legal nightmares. I mean, it's bad enough if you have a single law-breaking customer, the police might descend on you and take the server that they run on along with all the other customers that live on that server. But what if that server that the police want is actually an on-demand burstable virtual machine load balanced across several racks on which thousands or millions of other customers' virtual machines can and do run? The intermediaries will end up with two choices. Either put every customer they have at risk of random law enforcement blackouts, or resist or refuse to host anything unless it pays enough to hire a lawyer to make sure that it won't get them into trouble. And if they're hiring lawyers, you're going to be the ones paying for them. We've got intermediary law totally, absolutely backwards. With digital rights management, we've given intermediaries new rights they don't need and certainly don't deserve. The right to tell a creator's audience what they can do with the creator's works, even if the creator disagrees with them. With intermediary liability, we take away the right to host creative works from all comers, raising the bar for getting your work into the hands of your audience. Seriously, you could not do a worse job of designing a copyright system to protect creators if you set out to. So that's law number 2, and here's the thrilling conclusion, law number 3. Information doesn't want to be free. People do. You've doubtless heard information wants to be free. That's Stuart Brand's famous, iconic 1984 technology koan from the Hackers Conference, uttered to Steve Jobs. I swear, every time someone says that that's what this fight is about, the IETF kills a kitten. Because no one who fights for fair and reasonable information policy is doing so because information wants to be free. We're fighting because we want to be free. Not free to pirate your creative works, but free to own devices that don't let remote authorities set policy against our will and against our interests. Free to use networks that don't spy on us in case we're infringing a copyright. Free to communicate in private without having to worry that our personal lives will be made public in the name of protecting copyrights. DRM doesn't work, and every time we try to make it work, we end up inventing rootkits or rootkit-like technologies. Sony BMG famously shipped 6 million CDs that contained stealth malware that patched your kernel to allow them to run anti-copying processes without the OS seeing them or their associated files. Essentially, they punched this huge hole in the middle of your computer's immune system, and almost immediately, virus writers started cranking out malware that could cloak itself in the Sony rootkit. And games companies keep on repeating this lunacy. The 3DS, which came out this year, is a decent enough little pocket computer until you realize that every time you turn it on, it tries to connect to a network, even if you tell it not to. When it gets to a network, it tries to download new firmware, even if you don't want it to. And if it downloads new firmware and discovers that you've jailbroken it, it bricks your device. On PCs, Ubisoft's essential position is that when you play a game, they own your computer and every process running on it, and it should have the authority to inspect its entire internal workings. Now, those are the most egregious offenders, but they're hardly the only ones. Everyone from Hulu to Amazon Unbox to iBooks are trying to find ways to take over your computer and demanding that OS vendors and hardware companies build in the hooks that allow processes to run without the user's permission, even if the user doesn't want them there. So I'm a science fiction writer, and I write science fiction novels, not science fiction movies. And I go to see science fiction movies, and I often revel in the many differences. And the difference that always really gets up my butt is the self-destructing rocket ship. You've all seen this. There's a fight on the bridge, and someone slips, and their elbow hits a button, and a plummy voice that sounds eerily like Margaret Thatcher after her accent training starts counting down from 10 to the ship's irrevocable explosion. Now, I'm not an aerospace engineer, but when I see this, I think, wouldn't that be a better rocket ship if it wasn't designed to explode? Now, wouldn't our devices be better devices if they weren't designed to be rooted so that scumbags and creeps can watch what you do, control you, and look at your stuff? And on the intermediary side, we've got Viacom suing YouTube and demanding that courts take away YouTube's privacy flag because pirates might use it to hide uploads from enforcementware. But I use YouTube to send, and its privacy flag, to send videos of my toddler in the bath in my tiny flat in London to my parents at home in Toronto. Why should my capacity to conduct my personal life in private be subordinated to Viacom's business model? And it gets worse. In the UK, France, and New Zealand, they've passed internet disconnection laws that, yes, require ISPs to disconnect your internet connection if your IP address is named in a series of unsubstantiated copyright complaints. Now, the UN calls internet access a human right, and it's not hard to see why. My wife, Alice, who's just quit her job, but before she quit her job, she was working at Channel 4, one of Britain's public broadcasters, and she was their Commissioner for Education, and she worked with a lot of research on what networks did for families. And what she discovered through some of that research was that if you take the most vulnerable families in Britain, people living in public housing in the post-industrial north, and you compare like-for-like families where the only difference is that one of them has internet access, that the family with internet access has markedly better outcomes on every axis you can imagine. They have better nutrition, better social mobility, their kids get better grades, they have better jobs, they have more spending money, they're more civically engaged. In every way that you can imagine, their lives are improved by network access. Is there anyone in this room who'd have a job if we took away your home internet? And we're talking about taking away this network access, not from convicted pirates, but from people who happen to share an IP address with someone who's been accused of piracy. I don't think science fiction writers are necessarily very good predictors of the future, but there are two predictions that I think are very easy for me to make with some confidence. The first prediction is that copying is never, ever, ever going to get harder. Hard drives aren't going to get larger and bulkier and more capacious, or less capacious and more expensive. Networks aren't going to get harder to use and slower. There will never be fewer people who know how to type movie name BitTorrent into Google. From here on in, copying just gets easier. Your children will marvel at how hard copying was in 2011. And my second prediction is that everything we do in the physical world will increasingly require, not have, but require some online component. You and I and our children are increasingly inhabiting a world in which internet policy affects every single aspect of our lives. And copyright's law's scope is make an orderly, well-functioning marketplace for creative works, not govern every corner of human experience. This year, technology allowed revolutionaries in the Middle East to coordinate to challenge despotic rulers, and technology allowed the secret police to figure out who to round up, imprison, torture, and execute. If copyright's furtherance requires tilting the balance of technology to make the citizen's job harder and the secret policeman's job easier, we're doing copyright wrong. Thank you. So look, I'm a novelist. I pay my mortgage with copyright. I feed my family with copyright. And I really, really believe that we can make copyrights that pay artists without requiring absurdities like copy-proof bits or building a surveillance state into the fabric of the information society. I mean, just look at what copyright was in the earliest years of America. They set up a copyright system where you got a 14-year copyright that could be renewed again for 14 years, but only by the creator. And so what that meant is, you know, you turn up at a publisher's office and say, I wrote this book, I think it's really good, and they'd read it and they go, yeah, it's pretty good, we'll give you a raisin for it. And then they'd publish it, and it would be a bestseller. And 14 years later, the copyright would be about to expire. And they come back to you and they go, could you please renew this copyright for us? And you'd say, sure, but I want your kidney and your firstborn. We can make copyrights that ensure that people who create stuff get money. And they don't necessarily and can't involve surveillance. They can't involve this kind of control. We need to look for solutions like that today, and I think we'll find them. But I'll tell you what, if the only way to keep my trade alive is to redesign the devices that fill our pockets, run our cars, carry our love notes, and comprise our entire present-day system of political and civic engagement so that they spy on us and betray us, then I'm just going to go out and get a real job. Because I want to be free more than I want to be a writer. I want my daughter to, excuse me, I'm Eastern European ancestry, so I do this when I get misted up. I want my daughter to be free, I want my nation to be free, and I want our future to be free. If you agree, then take this back to your jobs and your politicians, join organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, boycott DRM platforms, get mouthy with your boss and your investors. We can secure livelihoods for creative people, and we can preserve technology's power to liberate. Let's keep the creative industries where they belong, on the side of free speech, free assembly, and freedom of conscience. Thank you. So they've just put 15 minutes on my clock for questions. Is there anyone who has a question? There's some mics set up in the aisles there. Oh, next aisle. Yeah, middle aisle.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think subscription-based services like Spotify are the solution to media distribution?
So I guess I think I will answer that question in two ways. First of all, I think Spotify is great as it goes, and it's lovely, and I think it's a great solution to a problem that some parts of the music industry were trying to solve. I think it's a mistake to look for the solution, because the solution implies that the technology landscape around it will remain static. And so I think that we can all be clear that whatever it is, whatever technological circumstances make Spotify profitable today will almost certainly change, and we'll need another solution tomorrow. But Spotify looks great today to the extent that it doesn't require that people build devices that are designed to stop you recording Spotify streams, because that A, won't work, and B, will compromise the integrity of your device, I think it's terrific. Next question.
You alluded to the fact that many artist groups were actually supporting Bill C-32 and took a strong stance against certain organizations that were saying, you know, this bill is not working. Some of the organizations I've worked with have had a concern that if we criticize Bill C-32 too heavily, that the artists will say, hey, why are you picking on the artists? We're for this. And potentially that the only people who could combat the artists are other artists. Do you have any recommendations as to what we should do to not fall into the poor artists speech that a lot of people are throwing?
Yeah, so how do we change the debate about Bill C-32 and laws like it so that we don't seem like we're anti-artist? I mean, the thing to remember is just because you're on their side, they're not on, it doesn't mean that they're on your side. And there have been plenty of times where artists have queued up to ask for what looked like a good deal for artists and ended up being a good deal for some other person in the supply chain. So, I mean, sampling is a good example of this in music, where we create longer terms of copyright and we narrow the scope of copyright so that, or rather widen the scope of copyright so that samples require a license. And what that means is that almost everything that you might want to sample is still in copyright. Almost all the copyrights are owned by 4 record labels. And that means that if you want to make sample-based works, you have to go to one of those companies and sign the record contract. And so even though you might be able to independently produce your work, the expansion of copyright has just made it possible for record labels to harvest and hold more of those rights and actually end up giving artists a worse deal because those rights are integral to the production of new work. I mean, people say, oh, why do you have to sample? Can't you make original works? There's a reason they call Brahms first, Beethoven's 10th. We've been sampling for as long as we've been making music. Next, Mike.
Hi, Cory. I was actually thinking when my colleague got up that I might just let you know that the Artist Legal Outreach, which is here in Vancouver, is one of the voices for artists around copyright. I'm a copyright lawyer, but don't let that stop you from talking to me.
So my best friends are copyright lawyers.
And, you know, there's a lot of artists are actually feeling as though they are not a part of the conversation around copyright in this country. They've been excluded from conversations about C-32. They're the biggest users of content that I know of. Most of my work is around basically educating people about what they can do, because there's a lot more that we can do. And in a technology crowd like this, with so many digitally engaged folk, we need you to realize that sometimes we need the education and the communication as well. I invite you to come to the New Forms Festival, where we're holding an exhibition and an event and discussions, artists and digital creators talking about copyright, September. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd love to come to the conference. I think at that point I'm actually already, my wife and I are turning 40 this year, so we have a little trip booked. So I hope you'll excuse me if I don't make it to that. But if you send me some email, I'll see if I can come up with some names. There's certainly people in Canada who'd be good to come and talk about that. Great. I also live like 7,000 miles from here.
Well, we actually spoke last year. So.
Sorry, say again?
We spoke last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Next question.
I know your focus is on copyright, but I'd be curious to hear your opinion on software patents. Yeah, software patents. So patents are not necessarily a terrible idea. And actually, one of the interesting things about patents is they've got a fairly narrow, fairly short term. The problem with patents overall has been that it's become very easy to get a patent, even if there's conflicting art. There's very few penalties for filing a patent, even if you know it doesn't pass the giggle test. And the US Patent and Trademark Office approach to patents has been, for the last sort of 20 years, let's just grant the patent and let the courts fight it out, which essentially means that people with a lot of money can litigate patents and people who don't have a lot of money end up getting hosed. Software patents are a particularly pernicious part of this. And I'm of the opinion that a software patent is essentially a patent on math, and that shouldn't be a patentable subject matter. And certainly we have parallel systems now that we have the EU without a software patent in the US with, and we can run some objective experiments. I mean, it's all well and good to talk about what we should and shouldn't have patents in, but it's even better to actually run 2 parallel experiments and get some facts into evidence. Thanks.
No problem.
It seems like a lot of the discussion having to do with the internet is that a lot of the providers of the infrastructure don't want to be relegated to being a utility. They don't want to be like the public waterworks or the power companies. But I was wondering, could there be possibly models from those industries that might be worth looking at? Or since this is something where the service being provided, it's not water, it's information, and that came from other people, is that kind of really the hang-up? Do you have any thoughts on that sort of utility model?
Yeah, so there's some really good network policy scholars who've written about this. A fellow Canadian and Torontonian, Tim Wu, who's now working for the Federal Trade Commission, wrote a book called The Master Switch that's a stellar potted history of communications theory and regulation, and how keeping telecoms separate from the services they provide is the best policy historically. Talk about repeating mistakes. Here in this country, the CRTC has completely ignored all the orthodox wisdom on how you manage a telecommunications infrastructure or ecosystem, and allowed the same companies to own the pipes as the production houses, as the video that's carried on them, and the phones, and it's been a fairly predictable disaster. Yeah?
I just wonder, as a writer, how long you think copyright should be protected, or how many
How long should copyright be protected? Yeah. So I think that's a great question because it surfaces what I think is a major mistake in how we treat copyrights today, which is we treat them all equally, as though every kind of copyright has exactly the same incentives. So people have gone to software companies and said, notoriously, I think it was Nathan Myhrvold from Microsoft was interviewed about this, and they was asked, if you had a 50-year term of copyright, how many fewer lines of code would you pay your programmers to write? And he said, well, we write exactly the same number of lines of code. And you can kind of keep slicing that down 40 years, 30 years. At what point do you actually get an appreciable drop in output? Well, that should, I think, be the right point to set a copyright term, maybe with some renewable elements in it, like I discussed earlier, like early American copyright. But I think the idea that the incentives and the business models that emerge from needlepoint, crossword puzzles, graphics software, pornography, and science fiction novels are all the same, and so they should all have the same term of copyright and the same regulatory contours is ridiculous. And I think when you put it that way, it becomes really clear on its face that we need to individually consider all of these as factual questions. So I think that's it, unless there's another question. Oh, here we go, one more.
One last question. I wanted to ask you about the surcharge on CDs and DVDs that were put in place in Sheila Copp's time, and that's been in Canada for a very, very long time. How has the record been, like, in terms of distributing those funds to artists that was supposed to help? And what do you see about surcharges on hard drives and other taxes of that sort?
So the question is about Canada's surcharge on media. I'm sorry, it's a little hard for me to hear the questions up here. I think the acoustics of those speakers are bouncing the sound back there. But the question is about surcharges on media that are then distributed to artists. And I think that is considered as a wider policy where you actually have blanket licenses, and then you figure out who's an easy point to collect the blanket license from, and then have some mechanism to distribute them to artists. It works pretty well. I mean, it's how radio and live music works. This venue pays a blanket license in order to play music, no doubt. I'm sure that they didn't clear the individual rights to the incidental music they played during the awards ceremony and so on. And so blanket licenses generally work pretty well because, like, if you're a suburban bar owner and it's 1 in the morning and someone wants to get up and sing a karaoke song, you don't want to have to call the composer's lawyer to find out whether or not they should be allowed to and how much it's going to cost in royalties. So having blanket setups work, but the devil is always in the details. Who do you collect the money from? How much do you collect? On what basis do you collect? So collecting by megabyte is a crazy idea because, as we all know, megabytes increase very quickly. You know, if you say, well, we're going to collect a penny for every 100 megabytes, that is a radically larger sum 10 years down the line. Just automatically, monotonically, storage is getting so much cheaper and larger. And so it might go from being 0.1% of the cost of the media to 100% of the cost of the media. But having a place where you collect some money and give it to artists in exchange for the use that might be made of that media is not an insane idea. Even though some people may not use the media that way, overall, the efficiencies that you realize in a system like that, generally are better than the costs that they incur on people who are incidental to it. In the same way that it's very hard, for example, to find an ISP that doesn't come with like an email address or web hosting. And you may already have an email address, you might have a Gmail account, and theoretically your ISP could charge you 11 cents less a month and not offer you the email address, but by the time they did the bookkeeping for it, it would actually cost you more. So I'm all for that kind of blanket license solution. If nothing else, it will do something that none of the measures that we've done to date have done, which is pay artists without criminalizing users. But I don't think that we've yet to find that we've yet found the right mix of those things. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up and leave you to the rest of your SIGGRAPH. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and thank you, SIGGRAPH, for inviting me.
So I just wanted to thank Cory again for giving a talk that I think we all in this room really needed to hear. Thank you again. Hey, so just a couple of housekeeping things. Please tell us about your SIGGRAPH conference experience. We're going to be sending out a SIGGRAPH conference survey at the end of the week, and we'll have a link to a survey. Also, please consider getting involved in future SIGGRAPH conference committees. This is your chance to make SIGGRAPH home. Now, go ahead and mingle with your friends and colleagues and have a great SIGGRAPH. Thank you.